before there was a flag, before there was even the name America. There was land vast, untamed, stretching from icy northern coasts to sweltering southern deserts. Imagine standing in silence on that land thousands of years ago. No skyscrapers, no railroads, not even the sound of horses, hooves only, the wind curling across endless plains, and the cries of eagles high above. This was a continent before the idea of a nation, a canvas waiting to be marked by human footsteps. The first people arrived not with declarations or governments, but with survival. Some scholars believe they came across a frozen land bridge from Asia more than 15,000 years ago, chasing herds of mammoth, following rivers, moving deeper into a wilderness no one had claimed. Others suggest different routes by sea, along rugged coastlines, in canoes that defied waves. However they came, they became the first Americans, forming tribes that adapted to mountains, forests, and swamps, each leaving their own marks on the soil. Their voices carried in chants around fires, their stories carved into rock, their lives tied to earth and sky. Long before the founding fathers, there were the mound builders of the Mississippi Valley, stacking earth into colossal shapes that still rise like shadows against modern skylines. There were the cliff dwellers of the Southwest, carving homes into stone walls that even now defy time. Each culture thrived, vanished, and left echoes behind whispers of a history that stretches far deeper than most school books dare to tell. It is here, in these forgotten beginnings, that the story of the United States truly takes root, not in 1776. Not with Columbus, but in the silent footsteps of hunters, the prayers of chiefs, and the mysterious ruins of civilizations whose names are barely remembered. Sit back, let your mind drift into the vast silence of that ancient land, and ask yourself, what does it mean that a nation was born on soil already rich with stories, already haunted with memory? The United States was not the beginning, it was a continuation, a layer on top of countless others. And so, to understand America, we must first walk into the deep shadows of its earliest past. Centuries pass. The land remains wild, untamed, pulsing with the heartbeat of native nations that stretch from ocean to ocean. But across the Atlantic, ships begin to stir in restless waters. The 15th and 16th centuries mark a turning point, a moment when the silence of the American forests will meet the echo of European ambition. Picture the sails of caravels swelling with wind, wooden hulls groaning as they cut across a stormy sea. The explorers carried maps half filled with guesswork, dreams of gold heavy in their minds, and a sense of destiny that would not stop at the edge of the horizon. Christopher Columbus arrives in 1492. Though some argue others may have touched these shores before him, Vikings in the cold north, or forgotten sailors swept by currents. Regardless of who came first, Columbus opened a door that would never again be shut. Spanish conquistadors pushed into the south, leaving behind missions, swords, and scars. The French traced rivers, claiming forests in the name of distant kings. The Dutch planted colonies, the English built towns, and all the while, the native tribes watched their world tilt, shift, and bleed. It was not merely discovery, it was collision, two worlds meeting with consequences neither fully understood. Diseases swept across the continent faster than any musket, faster than any horse, leaving silence where villages once thrived. At the same time, trade began to bind these new arrivals to the land, furs for muskets, corn for iron, fragile alliances that carried both promise and betrayal. Some saw opportunity, others saw only loss. Imagine the first English settlers stepping onto the Virginia coast hungry, weary, clutching hope in one hand and weapons in the other. They built wooden stockades, unsure if they had found a new home or a graveyard. Across the waters, more ships kept coming. The trickle would become a flood, until the forests echoed with languages that had never before crossed the ocean. This was the beginning of America's transformation and age, where ambition carved its first marks into the land, where strangers became settlers, and where the ground beneath their feet began to whisper of both empire and tragedy. And so the mystery deepens. Was this the start of a great nation's rise, or the unraveling of an older world whose story had been long in the making? The answer lies in the shadows of what came next, the colonies, the conflicts, and the fragile beginnings of what would one day call itself the United States. The 1600s were not gentle years. Life in the New World was harsh, uncertain, and often short. Yet the colonies began to take root, like stubborn plants pushing through stony ground. Along the Atlantic coast, fragile settlements grew into towns, towns into provinces, and provinces into the first outlines of a future nation. Jamestown, founded in 1607, stood as both a symbol of endurance and of desperation. Fires, famine, and disease claimed many, yet somehow it endured. Further north, the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth Rock, driven not by gold but by faith, a quest for religious freedom that would become a recurring theme in America's identity. Imagine their first winter, snow pressing against thin wooden walls, families huddled together, praying to survive each icy night. These colonies were diverse in their origins and purposes. The South built its wealth on tobacco and later cotton, crops that demanded vast fields and endless labor that soon gave rise to the dark stain of slavery. The North, with its rocky soil and colder climate, leaned on trade, shipbuilding, and fishing, creating bustling ports where merchants' voices mingled with sailor songs. In between, the middle colonies became a mosaic of cultures: Dutch, English, German, Swedish, each group planting their traditions, their foods, their faiths. Yet beneath the surface of growth lay constant tension. Relations with Native Americans shifted between uneasy alliances and brutal wars. Moments of cooperation shattered by mistrust and bloodshed. Colonists also clashed among themselves over religion, over land, over power, foreshadowing the restless spirit that would one day demand independence. And through it all, a sense of something new was quietly forming. The colonists, though still subjects of distant kings, began to see themselves as different, hardened by frontier life, tied not to palaces and crowns, but to forests, rivers, and soil they had worked with their own hands. Sit back and imagine a wooden tavern filled with smoke, voices debating taxes, rumors of uprisings, whispers of liberty. These seeds of self-awareness were fragile, but once planted, they would not die. The colonies were no longer just extensions of Europe, they were becoming something else entirely. And so the question lingers. How long could they remain loyal to kings across the sea when the land beneath their feet seemed to call them free? Whispers of discontent drifted across the colonies like smoke before a fire. By the mid-18th century, these once fragile settlements had grown into thriving societies, yet they remained tethered to the distant crown of Britain. For decades, colonists had lived with a kind of quiet independence, shaping their towns and economies, negotiating their own laws through assemblies, and building a life far removed from London's reach. But wars are expensive, and Britain's victories over France in the 7 Years' War left it deeply in debt. To the colonists' surprise, They were asked to help pay for an empire they had not fully asked to join. Taxes became the spark. The Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, the Teach New Law was more than a demand for money. It was a reminder that decisions affecting daily life were being made across an ocean without their consent. No taxation without representation was not merely a slogan. It was the voice of a people realizing they were treated as subjects, not partners. Picture Boston's cobblestone streets alive with anger, where pamphlets fluttered through taverns and fiery speeches stirred common farmers and wealthy merchants alike. Tensions boiled over on a winter's night in 1770, when British soldiers fired into a crowd, leaving bodies sprawled on the frozen ground. The Boston Massacre, as it was called, became a rallying cry, a wound in the memory of a city already restless. 3 years later, the Boston Tea Party turned defiance into spectacle men disguised as Mohawk warriors, heaving chests of British tea into the dark harbor waters. It was more than a protest against taxation. It was a declaration of spirit, a signal that the colonies were no longer afraid to challenge the crown. Britain answered with force, sending troops, tightening control, and closing ports. Yet the harder the empire pressed, the more the colonists pulled together. In Philadelphia, delegates gathered, debating freedom in words heavy with risk. Each man knew that to oppose the king was treason, punishable by death. Still, the murmur of rebellion grew louder, spreading from towns to farms, from villages to great cities. The air was charged with possibility, a nation waiting to be born. And so the stage was set for a confrontation that would forever change the course of history. The question was no longer if the colonies would resist, but whether they could survive. The storm they were calling down upon themselves. The first shots rang out on a quiet April morning in 1775 in the small towns of Lexington and Concord. No one knew it then, but the crack of musket fire echoing across those fields would ignite a war that would transform 13 colonies into something entirely new. Farmers, blacksmiths, and shopkeepers, shoulder to shoulder against one of the most powerful armies on earth. Their coats were plain, their weapons mismatched, yet their determination was fierce. From the very beginning, this was no ordinary war. It was a clash of ideals: empire versus independence, monarchy versus self-rule. Picture George Washington, a tall, commanding figure, taking command of the Continental Army under the fluttering banner of a cause that still felt fragile. His troops were hungry, poorly trained, often barefoot, yet they marched through snow and mud, driven by the belief that liberty was worth the sacrifice. Battles burned across the landscape Bunker Hill, where colonists fought fiercely before retreating. Trenton, where Washington led a daring winter attack across the icy Delaware River. And Saratoga, the turning point, where American victory convinced France to join their side. Each clash carried stories of bravery and suffering. Imagine the bitter winter at Valley Forge in 1777, men shivering in ragged tents, carving their shoes from scraps of leather, smoke rising from campfires that barely kept the cold at bay. Disease swept through the camp, yet they endured, training under Baron von Steuben, shaping themselves into a true army. Meanwhile, the Declaration of Independence had already been signed in 1776, its words echoing like thunder. All men are created equal. These were dangerous words, revolutionary words, words that sent shockwaves across the Atlantic. They gave meaning to the sacrifices, transforming the struggle from a rebellion into a quest for a nation. The war stretched on for years, draining both sides. But in 1781, at Yorktown, The British commander, Cornwallis, found himself surrounded American troops pressing in on land, French ships blocking escape by sea. When he surrendered, the dream of independence became real. The Treaty of Paris 2 years later confirmed it. The United States was born. Yet even in that moment of triumph, questions lingered. How would this fragile experiment survive without kings, without empires, without the old anchors of power? The war had been won, but the true test of freedom was only beginning. The war was over. The British had departed, and the dream of independence was no longer just ink on parchment. It was a living, breathing reality. Yet victory left the colonies with more questions than answers. How could 13 different states, each with its own traditions, currencies, and priorities, unite under a single government? At first, they tried with the Articles of Confederation, a loose agreement that bound them together but gave little real power to the center. It was an experiment in freedom without control, and it faltered almost immediately. Congress could not collect taxes, states quarreled over trade, and soldiers who had fought for liberty sometimes went unpaid. Whispers of disunity grew louder. Some even feared the young republic might collapse before it found its footing. But out of that uncertainty came one of the most remarkable gatherings in history, the Constitutional Convention of 1787 in Philadelphia. Men like George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, James Madison, and Alexander Hamilton debated deep into the night. Windows were closed, curtains drawn, secrecy sworn, as they argued over the shape of a nation yet unborn. Should power rest with the states, or with a strong central government? Should representation be equal, or based on population? Voices clashed, compromises were hammered out, and from weeks of tension emerged the United States Constitution, a framework both fragile and enduring. It created a system of checks and balances, with power divided between 3 branches: legislative, executive, and judicial. It was not perfect. It left untouched the contradictions of slavery and the rights of women, but it was revolutionary in its design. Soon after, the Bill of Rights was added, ensuring protections for speech, religion, and assembly, promises that gave flesh to the ideals declared a decade earlier. At the helm stood George Washington, unanimously chosen as the first president. His leadership set precedents that would define the office, serving only 2 terms, warning against foreign entanglements, and guiding the nation with dignity rather than power hunger. Yet challenges loomed on every horizon. Debt from the war burdened the treasury. Conflicts with native nations erupted as settlers pushed westward, and rivalries between states threatened unity. Still, the vision held. The republic was fragile, but it stood, built not on the authority of kings, but on the consent of the governed. The United States had taken its first steps into the uncertain future of nationhood. The ink on the Constitution had barely dried before the hunger for land began to push the young nation outward. To the east lay the Atlantic, a familiar boundary. But to the west stretched an ocean of possibility: forests, rivers, and plains that seemed endless, untamed, and waiting. At least, that was how the settlers saw it. For native nations who had lived there for centuries, it was not new land at all, but sacred ground inherited through generations, tied to identity, to spirit, to survival. The clash was inevitable. After the Revolutionary War, treaties were signed and broken almost as soon as they were made. Farmers and pioneers pressed across the Appalachians, cutting down forests, building cabins, carving paths into what they called the frontier. The Northwest Territory, today's Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin became a testing ground for the new nation's power. Native confederacies, led by leaders such as Tecumseh, resisted fiercely, seeing in the settlers not neighbors but invaders. Battles erupted, villages burned, and the U.S. Army clashed with warriors who knew the land far better than their enemies. Yet slowly, through force, disease, and broken promises, native peoples were pushed back. Westward expansion was not only about farmland, it was about vision. Thomas Jefferson dreamed of an empire of liberty, where freeholding farmers would stretch across the continent, building a republic unlike any seen before. That dream carried with it both hope and destruction. For while settlers saw opportunity, native nations saw erasure. Every mile gained by the United States was a mile lost to those who had called it home. The Louisiana Purchase in 1803 doubled the size of the nation almost overnight, fueling the imagination of what America could become. But with it came new conflicts, new displacements, and new promises that would never be honored. Trails carved through forests became highways of migration, and the word frontier grew into a national obsession, symbol of freedom to some, omen of loss to others. This was the paradox of expansion, the rise of a nation built upon the disappearance of another world. And as families packed wagons and pushed westward, one haunting question followed: could a country proclaim liberty while taking it away from those who stood in its path? As the 19th century dawned, the young republic stood at a crossroads. Its survival was no longer in question, but its future, its shape, its reach, its destiny remained uncertain. Into this moment stepped Thomas Jefferson, philosopher, farmer, revolutionary, and now the third president of the United States. Jefferson carried a vision unlike any before him. He dreamed of a nation of small landowners, where independence would flow not from wealth or power, but from the soil beneath one's feet. To him, the republic's strength lay not in crowded cities, but in the open countryside, where citizens could govern themselves, uncorrupted by tyranny or greed. Yet Jefferson's ideals soon collided with a chance so monumental, so unexpected, that it would forever alter the scale of America. In 1803, Napoleon Bonaparte, desperate for funds to fuel his European wars, offered to sell France's vast claim to lands west of the Mississippi River. For $15 million, about 4 cents an acre, the United States could more than double its size in a single stroke. Jefferson hesitated. The Constitution made no mention of purchasing territory, and he was a strict interpreter of its words. But the opportunity was too great, the vision too alluring. The Louisiana Purchase was signed, and overnight, America became a continental power in embryo. The sheer scope of it was staggering. Forests that stretched without end, plains that seemed like oceans of grass, mountains rising like fortresses, rivers longer than entire European kingdoms. To most Americans, it was land beyond imagination, both a gift and a mystery. But a purchase on paper was not the same as knowledge in reality. What lay beyond the Mississippi was largely unknown to the Republic. And so Jefferson commissioned an expedition that would become legend. The journey of Meriwether, Lewis, and William Clark. Their mission was to map the land, to study its plants and animals, to meet its peoples, and perhaps even find a passage to the Pacific. Guided by Sacagawea, a young Shoshone woman, the expedition revealed not just geography, but the scale of a nation's future. Yet even as Jefferson celebrated the purchase, shadows loomed. The land was not empty, and every step westward would deepen the struggle with native nations. The Louisiana Purchase was both triumph and omen, the moment America set its eyes across a continent. chasing a destiny it could barely begin to imagine. Barely a generation after winning independence, the United States once again found itself staring down its former master. Britain, locked in a titanic struggle with Napoleon in Europe, treated the fledgling republic not as an equal, but as a nuisance. American ships crossing the Atlantic were boarded, sailors dragged off and forced into the Royal Navy in a practice called impressment. Trade was choked, sovereignty mocked, and resentment burned hotter with each passing year. Some Americans whispered that independence itself was still unfinished, that the revolution had only paused rather than truly ended. By 1812, voices calling for war drowned out those of caution, and Congress declared a conflict that would test the Republic's survival. But the war did not unfold like a story of triumph. The United States was young, militarily weak, and divided. Attempts to invade Canada faltered. British troops marched almost unopposed through Washington, D.C., setting fire to the Capitol and the White House, the flames painting the night sky with humiliation. And yet, amid loss, defiance rose. At Fort McHenry in Baltimore, as rockets and shells lit the harbor, the American flag still waved at dawn, an image that would inspire Francis Scott Key to pen words that became the national anthem. On the seas, nimble American frigates like the USS Constitution stunned the mighty Royal Navy, earning the nickname Old Ironsides as cannonballs seemed to bounce off her hull. And in the war's closing chapter, General Andrew Jackson turned a ragtag army of militia, frontiersmen, and even pirates into an unlikely force that crushed the British at the Battle of New Orleans. Victory that came after peace had technically been signed in Europe, but one that burned into American memory as proof of resilience. When the Treaty of Ghent ended the war, nothing on paper seemed to change. Borders remained the same, no grand concessions were made. Yet the war shifted something deeper. America had stood its ground against one of the world's greatest powers and had not been destroyed. Pride swelled, nationalism grew, and the young republic began to see itself not as fragile, but as enduring. Still, beneath the celebrations, one could not ignore the cost. Native nations who had allied with Britain were left shattered, their resistance further broken, their lands slipping away. The War of 1812 was more than a second revolution, it was a mirror, reflecting both America's strength and the shadows of the struggles yet to come. When the smoke of the War of 1812 finally cleared, the United States entered a period that history would later call the era of good feelings. On the surface, it seemed true enough. The Federalist Party had collapsed, leaving a single dominant political force in the Democratic Republicans. National pride surged. Cities grew, trade expanded, and the scars of conflict began to heal. President James Monroe toured the country, greeted by cheering crowds, embodying the sense that America had survived its tests and was stepping into a new age of stability. Yet beneath this calm surface, currents of division were already pulling the nation apart. Expansion continued westward, each new territory raising the same burning question: would it allow slavery or would it not? In 1820, the Missouri Compromise attempted to ease the tension, admitting Missouri as a slave state and Maine as a free state, drawing a line across the map to mark where slavery could and could not extend. It was a temporary solution, but like a thin patch over a widening crack, it hinted at future conflict. At the same time, the Industrial Revolution began reshaping the landscape. In the north, factories rose, smokestacks filled the skies, and a new class of workers crowded into cities. In the south, The cotton gin transformed agriculture, making slavery not weaker, but more entrenched and profitable. Two economies, two ways of life, were developing side by side, increasingly at odds. And while the Monroe Doctrine of 1823 boldly declared the Americas off-limits to European colonization, asserting the United States as a rising power on the world stage, the nation itself was deeply unsettled within. Native nations, once again, bore the heaviest cost of expansion. Pressed further from their lands, they faced broken treaties and forced migration, as settlers claimed farms, towns, and fortunes in the name of progress. So while newspapers praised an age of unity and peace, the foundations of future conflict were being laid in silence. The era of good feelings was less a golden moment than a fragile truce, one where pride masked tension and growth carried seeds of division. The nation smiled outwardly, but its heart beat with unspoken anxieties, an unease that would only grow louder with each passing decade. By the 1820s, a new figure strode onto the national stage, a man who embodied both the promise and the contradictions of America, Andrew Jackson. To his supporters, he was a hero of the common man, a rugged general who had fought at New Orleans and carried the scars of battle as proof of his devotion to the Republic. To his critics, he was dangerous, impulsive, a populist who placed passion above principle. Yet Jackson's rise signaled something undeniable. The voice of the ordinary, white male citizen was beginning to reshape politics. Property requirements for voting were falling away, opening the ballot box to millions more. Elections became spectacles filled with rallies, slogans, and fierce partisanship. This was the birth of mass democracy in the United States, and Jackson stood at its center. His presidency was marked by bold actions and deep controversies. He wielded the veto power more aggressively than any before him, striking down legislation he believed betrayed the people's will. He fought the Second Bank of the United States, calling it a tool of elites, and his victory over it became a triumph for his supporters, but also unleashed economic instability that would haunt the country. More troubling was his policy toward Native Americans. The Indian Removal Act of 1830, signed under Jackson, set into motion one of the darkest chapters in American history. Entire nations, the Cherokee, Choctaw, Creek, Chickasaw, and Seminole, were forced from their ancestral lands, marched westward along routes that became known as the Trail of Tears. Thousands died along the way, their homes abandoned, their culture uprooted, their voices lost in the march of progress. Jackson himself defended the policy as necessary for expansion, but its cruelty left a wound on the nation's conscience. Yet, despite the tragedies, his era energized the idea that government belonged to the people, not distant elites. Campaigns became more democratic, participation surged, and politics grew rougher, more direct, and more emotional. The age of Jackson was a paradoxal expansion of political voice for some, and an erasure of rights for others. It reflected the contradictions of a young nation, proud of its freedom, yet blind to those it excluded. And as Jackson left office, the United States was larger, louder, and more restless than ever before, marching forward with confidence, but carrying shadows it could not yet face. As the 19th century pressed forward, the restless energy of America seemed to point in one direction west. Across the horizon lay mountains, deserts, rivers, and plains that few citizens of the young republic had seen, yet many believed were theirs by right. This belief soon took on a name: Manifest Destiny. It was more than ambition, it was conviction. The idea that the United States was destined, even ordained, to stretch from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific. Politicians framed it as progress, newspapers as inevitability, preachers as divine will. And so families loaded wagons, settlers staked claims, and trails like the Oregon and Santa Fe became lifelines across a continent. For many, the West was promised land to farm, fortunes to seek, freedom to grasp. Gold in California, fertile valleys in Oregon, open skies in Texas all fed the imagination of a nation hungry for more. But behind every mile of progress stood a cost that was quietly devastating. Native nations once again found themselves uprooted, pushed aside or destroyed, their homelands swallowed in the surge of settlement. Entire ways of life disappeared, replaced by fences, railroads, and towns. The push westward also strained the delicate balance of the Union. Every new territory asked the same explosive question: would it allow slavery? The Missouri Compromise had drawn a line, but the map kept changing, and the arguments grew louder. The annexation of Texas, the war with Mexico, and the conquest of vast lands in the Southwest brought new riches and new divisions. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848 handed the United States half of Mexico's territory, opening deserts and coastlines that would one day be California, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, and more. Yet with each gain, the shadow deepened. Free states and slave states eyed each other with suspicion. Compromises patched the wounds, but none healed them. Expansion, once a dream of opportunity, became a stage where the nation's contradictions played out more fiercely than ever before. To the settlers, manifest destiny felt like a promise fulfilled. To the displaced, it was devastation. To the enslaved, it raised the question of whether bondage would spread westward like the nation itself. And so, with every wagon that rolled across the plains, America marched not just toward the Pacific, but toward an inevitable reckoning. In the mid-1840s, the idea of manifest destiny collided with the reality of international borders. Texas, once a Mexican province, had declared its independence and now sought entry into the United States. When America annexed it in 1845, Mexico viewed the act as theft, an open insult to its sovereignty. Tensions flared along the Rio Grande, and soon shots were fired. Thus began the Mexican-American War, a conflict that some hailed as inevitable progress and others condemned as naked aggression. American forces, led by generals like Zachary Taylor and Winfield Scott, pushed deep into Mexican territory. Battles erupted at Palo Alto, Monterrey, Buena Vista, and Veracruz, culminating in the dramatic capture of Mexico City. Soldiers marched through the halls of the capital, raising the stars and stripes in triumph. For many, it seemed proof that the young republic was destined to expand, a continental power in the making. Yet even in victory, unease haunted the nation. Critics such as Henry David Thoreau and Abraham Lincoln denounced the war as unjust, an act of conquest cloaked in the language of destiny. Newspapers in the North asked whether this expansion was truly about liberty, or simply the extension of slavery into new lands. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848 confirmed America's victory. Mexico ceded vast territories: California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming, forever changing the shape of the nation. The Pacific coast was now within reach, and with it dreams of ports, trade, and wealth. But the triumph was poisoned by division. Would these new territories permit slavery, or would they remain free? Southerners saw the land as fertile ground for their way of life. Northerners viewed it as an opportunity to halt slavery's spread. The debates grew louder, more bitter, more dangerous. And in the same year, a discovery in California set the nation ablaze. The gold rush. Tens of thousands rushed west in search of fortune, swelling the population, demanding statehood, and forcing Congress to confront the slavery question once again. The Mexican-American War had given America new land, new power, and new pride. But it had also deepened the fissures that split the Union. The map had changed, but so too had the stakes. The Republic had grown larger, but also more fragile, and the question lingered like a storm cloud. How long could the nation balance expansion with division before it finally collapsed? By 1850, the United States stood at a breaking point. The vast new lands won from Mexico had reignited the firestorm over slavery, and Congress once again scrambled to preserve a fragile peace. Out of this crisis emerged the Compromise of 1850, a collection of laws that sought to balance the demands of North and South. California, swollen with settlers from the gold rush, entered the Union as a free state, pleasing the North. But in return, the South received a law so severe, so divisive, that it would echo in every town and city. The Fugitive Slave Act. This act required citizens in free states to aid in the capture of runaway slaves and return them to bondage. Federal marshals could drag fugitives from homes, courts, or streets, often without trial or defense. For the enslaved who had risked everything for freedom, the North was no longer safe. Underground railroad networks were pushed deeper into secrecy, and abolitionists grew more defiant, their voices sharpened by outrage. The Compromise also allowed territories like Utah and New Mexico to decide for themselves whether to permit slavery, a principle called popular sovereignty. On paper, it seemed democratic. In practice, it invited chaos, as settlers and agitators clashed violently to sway the outcome. At the same time, the slave trade was banned in Washington, D.C., a symbolic victory for abolitionists, though slavery itself remained untouched in the capital. The Compromise of 1850 was hailed by some as a necessary truce, a way to keep the Union intact. But beneath the signatures and speeches lay deepening mistrust. In the North, the sight of free citizens forced to participate in slavery hardened anti-slavery sentiment. In the South, any restriction on the spread of slavery was seen as an attack on their way of life. The center ground was shrinking, and each new law seemed less like a solution and more like a warning. The United States was no longer simply divided, was polarized, with each side convinced that the other threatened its survival. For a moment, the Union staggered forward, patched but not healed. The Compromise bought time, but not peace. And as the decade unfolded, that time would be consumed by conflict, violence, and a rising chorus of voices declaring that compromise was no longer possible. The march toward disunion had begun, and there would be no turning back. The uneasy peace secured by the Compromise of 1850 soon crumbled under the weight of its own contradictions. Nowhere was this more visible than in the Kansas Territory, a place that became the proving ground for the nation's deepest divide. Under the principle of popular sovereignty, Kansas was to decide for itself whether to allow slavery. But instead of ballots alone, the decision would be written in blood. Pro-slavery settlers poured in from Missouri, determined to secure the territory for the South. At the same time, abolitionists and free soilers streamed from the North, equally committed to keeping Kansas free. The land became a battlefield. Towns erupted in riots, ballot boxes were stuffed or stolen, and armed militias clashed on prairies that only a few years before had been quiet farmland. Newspapers across the country began to call it Bleeding Kansas, a name that captured both the violence and the symbolic weight of the struggle. One man in particular emerged as a figure of both fear and fascination. John Brown, a stern abolitionist who believed slavery was a sin that could only be purged with blood. Brown and his followers carried out brutal attacks on pro-slavery settlers, hacking them down in the night at Pottawatomie Creek. To some, he was a prophet. To others, a murderer. Kansas became more than a territoriate, became a warning of what was coming. The violence spread far beyond its borders, echoing in Congress itself. In 1856, Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts delivered a fiery anti-slavery speech, mocking pro-slavery politicians. Days later, on the Senate floor, Representative Preston Brooks of South Carolina beat him nearly to death with a cane. The message was unmistakable. Words were no longer enough, and even the halls of government could not contain the rage. Each skirmish, each death, each broken law deepened the fracture between North and South. Kansas had been intended as a test of democracy, but it revealed instead that compromise was failing, and the republic itself was drifting toward civil war. The prairie fires of Kansas were not isolated, they were sparks falling on a nation already dry with anger. And as the decade closed, it was clear that the question of slavery could no longer be settled with negotiations or paper agreements. The next chapter would demand something far greater and far more terrible. In the midst of growing division, a tall, lanky lawyer from Illinois began to step onto the national stage. Abraham Lincoln was not born into privilege or power. He came from a log cabin, a frontier boy who split rails and read books by firelight. Yet his voice, calm but firm, carried the weight of reason in an age of chaos. Lincoln did not seek fame for its own sake. He sought clarity in a time when truth itself seemed blurred by shouting and bloodshed. His debates with Stephen A. Douglas in 1858 electrified the nation. The two men stood before crowded halls, arguing the question that hovered over every meal, every pulpit, every state house. Could the United States endure half slave and half free? Lincoln insisted it could not. A house divided, he warned, could not stand. For many in the North, his words rang with both urgency and fear, while in the South, they sounded like a threat. As Lincoln's reputation grew, so too did the tension. Then came John Brown again, striking in 1859 at Harper's Ferry, leading a desperate raid on a federal arsenal in the hope of sparking a slave uprising. The attempt failed, Brown was captured, and soon hanged. But his last words echoed like prophesying the nation that the crimes of slavery could only be washed away in blood. To the South, Brown was a terrorist. To the North, he became a martyr. The line between compromise and conflict had thinned to a thread. When the election of 1860 arrived, the country held its breath. Lincoln, representing the Republican Party, faced a fractured field. The Democrats had split, North against South, and votes scattered across regional lines. In the end, Lincoln won not with a sweeping mandate, but with a divided victory that revealed how broken the nation had become. His triumph was met with celebration in the North, but with fury in the South. To many Southerners, Lincoln's election meant the beginning of the end for their way of life. Before he could even take office, Southern states began to whisper of secession. It was no longer a question of whether the Union could survive, it was a question of how and at what cost. The nation stood on a precipice, its future trembling in uncertainty, as Lincoln prepared to guide it into the storm. The election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 was more than a political outcome, was a spark striking dry kindling. In Charleston, South Carolina, the bells that rang were not in celebration but in alarm. The southern states saw Lincoln not merely as a president but as a symbol of northern domination and the death of slavery. Within weeks, South Carolina made its move. On December 20th, 1860, its leaders gathered and voted to secede from the Union. The announcement echoed across the South like a cannon shot. And one by one, other states followed: Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. Each declaration was filled with language of sovereignty, states' rights, and liberty. But beneath those words lay the undeniable truth: slavery was the heart of the matter. As the nation fractured, Southern leaders moved swiftly to build their new government. In February 1861, delegates met in Montgomery, Alabama, and proclaimed the birth of the Confederate States of America. They drafted a constitution that closely resembled the U.S. Constitution but left no ambiguity about slavery. It was to be permanent, protected, and central to their new nation. At the helm of this confederacy stood Jefferson Davis, a Mississippi senator and former U.S. Secretary of War. Davis was no fiery radical like some of his peers. He was a man of discipline and formality. Yet he accepted the role reluctantly, convinced that the South had been forced into secession by Northern aggression. In Washington, Lincoln prepared to take office, his journey shadowed by rumors of assassination plots. The country he was sworn to lead was already splitting beneath his feet. By the time he delivered his inaugural address in March 1861, 7 states had already seceded, and more threatened to follow. In that speech, Lincoln reached for conciliation. He declared he had no intention to interfere with slavery where it already existed. He pleaded with Southerners not to turn hostility into war, reminding them that we are not enemies, but friends. But his words, however carefully chosen, were drowned by the drumbeat of secession. The Confederacy had already raised its banners, already begun assembling its armies. The United States, born in revolution less than a century earlier, now stood on the edge of tearing itself apart. Both sides spoke of honor, of rights, of destiny. Yet behind their rhetoric, the question remained as brutal as it was simple. Could a nation founded on liberty endure while half of its people remained in bondage? The answer would soon be written in blood. The harbor at Charleston was quiet in the spring of 1861, but beneath the calm waters tension churned like an unseen tide. In its center stood Fort Sumter, a federal stronghold rising from a man-made island of stone and brick. Inside its walls, Union Major Robert Anderson and fewer than 100 soldiers clung to their post, surrounded by the forces of South Carolina. Supplies were dwindling. The men grew thin, weary, and uncertain. Outside the fort, Confederate guns were being positioned with mathematical precision, their barrels aimed directly at Anderson's bastion. The standoff was unbearable. President Lincoln, only weeks into his presidency, faced a terrible choice. To resupply the fort risked provoking war. To abandon it meant surrendering authority and legitimacy. He chose a middle path, sending ships with food, not arms, a gesture that carried both defiance and restraint. The Confederacy, under Jefferson Davis, interpreted it as a challenge. On April 12, 1861, as dawn broke, a signal shell arced across the dark sky, its fiery tail glowing against the waters. A thunderous boom followed, and soon the Confederate batteries roared to life. The first shots of the Civil War had been fired. For 34 hours, smoke and flame engulfed the fort. Cannonballs shattered walls, ignited wooden structures, and sent bricks cascading into heaps. Inside, Anderson's men fought the fire as much as the enemy, scrambling to save powder magazines from exploding. The American flag, battered and torn, was lowered and raised again, a symbol of endurance amid ruin. But by April 13th, the defenders could no longer hold. With their supplies gone and their fort reduced to rubble, Anderson agreed to surrender. Remarkably, not a single man on either side had died in the bombardment, yet the symbolic weight of Sumter was immense. Across the North, newspapers declared the Union must be preserved. Crowds filled city streets, calling for enlistment. Men who had never held a rifle pledged to defend the flag. In the South, the mood was electric, almost celebratory. The Confederacy had defied the Union and forced its retreat. It was proof, many Southerners believed, that their cause was righteous and their destiny unstoppable. Yet beneath the cheering and marching bands, a darker realization spread. This war would not be short, nor bloodless. Both sides believed victory would come swiftly, but the shots at Fort Sumter marked only the beginning of a conflict that would demand the lives of hundreds of thousands and test whether the United States could survive its own division. The surrender at Fort Sumter was more than a military event. It was a point of no return. Almost overnight, the United States transformed from a fractured republic into two mobilizing nations preparing for war. In the North, Abraham Lincoln issued a call for 75,000 volunteers to put down what he described as an insurrection. The response was staggering. From bustling cities to quiet rural towns, men flocked to recruiting stations, their hats in hand and fire in their eyes. Some came driven by patriotism, others by adventure, and many by a sense of duty to preserve the Union their fathers and grandfathers had fought to build. Yet Lincoln's call had an unintended consequence. For more states, Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina, refused to send troops against their southern neighbors. Instead, they seceded, swelling the ranks of the Confederacy and tipping the balance further toward division. Richmond, Virginia, soon became the Confederate capital, placing the heart of the rebellion a mere 100 miles from Washington, D.C. in both North and South. Cities erupted with parades, speeches, and martial music. Uniforms were hastily sewn, muskets dusted off, and militias formalized into armies. Camps sprouted like small cities, their rows of white canvas tents glowing by lantern light. The air filled with the sounds of drills, shouted orders, and the metallic clash of bayonets being fixed to rifles. Yet beneath the excitement was chaos. Neither side was truly prepared for the scale of conflict about to unfold. The Union had industry, railroads, and manpower, but its armies lacked experienced leadership. The Confederacy had fewer resources but boasted generals who had studied the art of war at West Point and now turned their knowledge against their former comrades. Families were torn apart as brothers chose opposite flags. Letters from this time reveal both pride and dread. Mothers wept quietly as sons marched away. Sweethearts exchanged keepsakes with trembling hands. Many soldiers carried Bibles or locks of hair in their breast pockets, tokens of the world they were leaving behind. The sense that war would be short over in a matter of months lingered on both sides. Few yet imagined the rivers of blood that would follow. But as spring turned to summer in 1861, the lines were drawn. Two nations, born of the same revolution, were now preparing to test whether unity or secession would decide the future. And in the midst of this fevered mobilization, both sides fixed their eyes on the same horizon, the first great clash of armies, a battle that would show the world how determined each truly was. The heat of July 1861 pressed heavy upon the rolling fields of Virginia. Dust clung to boots, sweat stung eyes, and the tension of two nations built to a breaking point. On the banks of a winding creek called Bull Run, the first great clash of the Civil War unfolded. Union forces under Brigadier General Irvin McDowell marched from Washington with confidence. Their path was shadowed by picnickers, civilians carrying baskets and blankets, eager to watch what many assumed would be a swift Union victory. Newspapers had promised a short war, and this battle was expected to bring it to an end. But across the creek, Confederate troops under General Pierre Gustave Taunt Beauregard waited, their numbers bolstered by reinforcements under General Joseph E. Johnston. Both sides, green and untested, carried not just muskets but immense pressure to prove their cause. The battle began at dawn on July 21st. Union cannons thundered, shaking the ground, while blue-coated soldiers surged forward, pushing the Confederates back. Early momentum favored the North, and cries of triumph echoed among the onlookers. Yet war has a way of shifting with the wind. At a crucial moment, a Virginian brigade under General Thomas J. Jackson stood firm upon a ridge, their discipline in the chaos-inspired Confederate lines, and a fellow general pointed, shouting, "There stands Jackson like a stone wall." From that moment, Jackson earned his immortal nickname, and Confederate morale surged. By afternoon, the tide had turned. Fresh Confederate troops poured onto the field, and the Union advance collapsed into confusion. Soldiers who had marched with pride now stumbled in retreat, their muskets abandoned along the roadside. The spectators, who had come to witness glory, found themselves caught in the chaos of panicked soldiers flooding back toward Washington. Wagons overturned, men shouted, horses reared, and the dream of a quick, decisive victory dissolved into bitter reality. By nightfall, Bull Run belonged to the Confederacy, and the illusion of a short war was shattered. The battle claimed nearly 5,000 casualties, a shocking toll for a nation that had barely begun to grasp the cost of civil conflict. For the Union, the defeat was humiliating, but it carried a grim lesson. This war would not be won with haste or overconfidence. For the Confederacy, the victory brought celebration, yet also a sobering truth: the Union would not dissolve easily. Both sides had been baptized by fire, and the war that stretched ahead would demand far more than parades, promises, or bravado. It would demand endurance measured in blood, suffering, and years of unrelenting struggle. After Bull Run, the dream of a quick, bloodless war evaporated. Both the Union and the Confederacy recognized that this struggle would be long, brutal, and fought on every front imaginable: land, river, and sea. Each side began shaping strategies that revealed their strengths, their weaknesses, and their vision of victory. For the Union, the plan came to be known as the Anaconda Plan. Designed by General Winfield Scott, the aging hero of earlier wars. Its purpose was to strangle the Confederacy like a serpent encircling its prey. The North would blockade southern ports, cutting off vital trade and crippling the South's ability to export cotton or import weapons. At the same time, Union forces would seize control of the Mississippi River, slicing the Confederacy in two and choking its lifelines. It was a plan of patience, economic pressure, and relentless encirclement. The Confederacy, however, sought a different path. Lacking the industrial might of the North, its strategy hinged on endurance and defiance. Southern leaders believed if they could hold out long enough, the Union would tire of the war's cost. They also gambled on foreign intervention. King Cotton diplomacy was their weapon, the belief that Britain and France, dependent on Southern cotton for their textile industries, would side with the Confederacy to preserve their supply. To the Southern mind, the hunger of Europe's mills would prove more powerful than Northern armies. As these strategies took shape, the war began to expand geographically. Skirmishes flared in Missouri and Kentucky, border states whose allegiance remained uncertain. In the West, Union forces sought to penetrate the Confederate heartland along rivers, while in the East, both armies stared at each other across the Potomac, preparing for new campaigns. The conflict also took to the seas. Union warships patrolled the Atlantic and Gulf coasts, intercepting blockade runners, while Confederate raiders struck Northern shipping with daring precision. It was no longer a war of isolated battles, but a sprawling, interconnected contest that touched every corner of the divided nation. The human cost, too, began to spread. Families across both North and South felt the absence of sons, brothers, and fathers as conscription loomed. Farms lost their workers, factories hummed with war production, and women stepped into roles they had never held before. The war seeped into daily life, no longer a distant clash of armies, but a presence that colored every letter, every prayer, and every hope. From this widening scope, one truth became undeniable. The Civil War was no longer simply about states' rights or secession. It was about survival, whether a union could endure, or whether a confederacy could carve a permanent place from its soil, while the Eastern armies glared at one another across Virginia's rivers. It was in the Western theater that the Union first tasted real momentum. Here, rivers like the Tennessee and the Mississippi were not just waterways. They were highways into the Confederate heartland. Whoever controlled them controlled supply lines, transport, and the ability to split the South in two. Into this stage stepped an unlikely figure, Ulysses S. Grant, a quiet, often rumpled officer with a past clouded by failure. Grant had once resigned from the army under rumors of drinking. By 1861, he was working in obscurity, selling firewood on the streets of Illinois. Yet war has a way of drawing out hidden qualities, and in Grant the Union discovered a leader who combined boldness with relentless determination. In February 1862, Grant struck at Fort Henry on the Tennessee River, supported by Union gunboats. The victory came swiftly, but his eyes were already set further. Just days later, he moved against Fort Donelson on the Cumberland River. The fighting was fierce, snow covering the ground as both sides clashed in bitter cold. When the Confederate commander sought terms, Grant delivered his now famous demand: no terms except unconditional and immediate surrender. From that moment, he became known as Unconditional Surrender Grant, a symbol of Northern resolve. These victories electrified the Union and sent shockwaves through the Confederacy. Tennessee, once firmly in Southern hands, began to crumble. The Union had cracked open a gateway to the Deep South, and Grant's name spread across newspapers as the general who finally delivered results. But the war in the West was far from over. In April 1862, Confederate forces launched a surprise attack at Shiloh, catching Grant's army off guard. The two-day battle was a bloodbath, with fields littered by the dead and wounded. Grant himself later admitted he had never imagined such carnage was possible. Yet even in the face of staggering losses, he refused to retreat. Reinforcements arrived. The Union counterattacked, and the Confederates fell back. Shiloh proved costly more than 23,000 casualties, but it reinforced Grant's reputation as a commander who did not break under pressure. Through mud, smoke, and blood, he pushed forward, embodying a grim endurance that mirrored the Union's struggle itself. As the Western campaigns advanced, the Mississippi River loomed as the ultimate prize. To take it would sever the Confederacy and prove the strength of the Anaconda Plan, and standing at the forefront of that vision was a general whose rise from obscurity reflected the nation's own desperate climb from doubt into determination. While victories in the West brought the Union hope, the story in the East was far darker, marked by frustration, hesitation, and repeated disappointment. At the heart of it all lay Virginia, the jewel of the Confederacy, where two capitals, Washington and Richmond, stood less than a day's ride apart. Between them stretched rolling hills, tangled forests, and winding rivers, all soon to be soaked in blood. The Union's first great effort to capture Richmond came under General George B. McClellan, a man whose brilliance in organization was matched only by his caution. Nicknamed Little Napoleon, McClellan transformed raw recruits into a disciplined army, drilling them until their formations gleamed with precision. Yet, when it came to battle, he was haunted by the fear of being outnumbered, often convinced incorrectly that Confederate forces vastly outmatched his own. In the spring of 1862, McClellan launched the Peninsula Campaign, moving his massive army by water to the Virginia coast and beginning a slow march toward Richmond. The plan was sound, the resources immense, but the execution faltered. Confederate resistance stiffened, swamps slowed progress, and McClellan's constant requests for reinforcements frustrated Lincoln, who grew weary of his general's hesitations. Then came the rise of Robert E. Lee. After General Joseph E. Johnston was wounded, Lee took command of the Army of Northern Virginia. At first, some doubted him, but Lee soon revealed a daring mind, unafraid to divide his forces and strike with audacity. In a series of battles known as the 7 Days, Lee pushed McClellan's vast army back from the gates of Richmond. The Confederates suffered heavy losses, but they had defended their capital, and Lee emerged as a figure of almost mythic stature. The Union, once again, was forced to retreat. Through the rest of 1862, the pattern repeated itself. At Second Bull Run, Union forces under General John Pope met a crushing defeat, driven from the field by Lee's cunning maneuvers. In December, at Fredericksburg, Union troops marched in wave after wave against Confederate positions entrenched on a sunlit hill, only to be cut down in staggering numbers. Northern newspapers mourned the slaughter pen, and morale plummeted. Families began to ask whether the war could ever be won. In the East, victory remained elusive, and the Union seemed cursed by leadership that could not match the skill and daring of Lee. Yet the struggle continued. For Washington could not fall, and Richmond could not stand untouched forever. The clash of wills along Virginia's rivers and ridges became a brutal chess match, one where each move was written not in ink, but in blood. September 1862 brought a turning point, one carved in smoke and fire along the banks of Antietam Creek in Maryland. After a string of victories, Robert E. Lee dared to carry the war onto northern soil. His hope was bold by invading Maryland. He might inspire its people to join the Confederacy, shake northern morale, and perhaps even secure European recognition. But the Union, desperate for a triumph, moved to block him. General George B. McClellan, restored to command despite past hesitations, marched his vast Army of the Potomac to intercept Lee. Fate gave McClellan a gift. Union soldiers discovered a copy of Lee's battle plans wrapped around cigars, revealing the Confederates' movements. Yet even with this priceless advantage, McClellan moved cautiously, giving Lee time to regroup. When the armies finally clashed near the small town of Sharpsburg, the result was nothing short of apocalyptic. At dawn on September 17th, Union artillery opened fire, and the battle erupted in full fury. Cornfields became killing grounds as men advanced and fell by the thousands, stalks cut down alongside soldiers. The Dunker Church, a humble whitewashed building, became a landmark of horror as volleys thundered around it. By midday, the sunlit stone bridge over Antietam Creek ran red as Union troops stormed across under withering fire. Everywhere, smoke hung heavy, the air choked with powder and the cries of the wounded. Soldiers described bodies lying in heaps, the ground slick and treacherous with blood. In a single day, more than 22,000 men were killed, wounded, or missing the bloodiest day in American history. Neither side emerged with a clear tactical victory, yet Lee's invasion was halted. His battered army withdrew back into Virginia, and the Union claimed the field. For Lincoln, this was enough. Though frustrated by McClellan's failure to destroy Lee's army, he seized the moment to issue a proclamation that would forever change the war. Just days later, Lincoln announced the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, declaring that enslaved people in rebellious states would be free as of January 1st, 1863. Drenched in suffering, thus became not just a battle of blood, but a battle of ideas. The war shifted from a fight merely to preserve the Union into a moral crusade against slavery itself. Yet the cost was searing. Fields lay strewn with unburied dead, families searched in vain for loved ones, and soldiers on both sides wrote in letters that the memory of Antietam would never leave them. The United States had endured its darkest single day, and the shadow it cast stretched long over the months to come. When the guns fell silent at Antietam, the battlefield seemed like the very mouth of Hellrose of the dead. Wounded men crying out beneath a sky still grey with smoke. Yet from that grim field, Abraham Lincoln found the leverage he had been waiting for. On September 22, 1862, he issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, and by the first day of the new year, it became official. With one stroke of the pen, Lincoln declared that enslaved people in all states in rebellion against the United States were henceforth and forever free. It was a document both practical and profound, reshaping the very meaning of the war. On paper, the Emancipation Proclamation freed millions, though its reach was limited. It did not touch slavery in the loyal border states or in areas of the South already under Union control. Freedom could only be enforced where Union armies advanced. Yet its symbolic power was immense. No longer was the war fought simply to preserve the Union. It was now a fight against the institution of slavery itself. The Confederacy, once clinging to the hope of European intervention, saw those dreams collapse. Britain and France, reluctant to support a cause now explicitly tied to slavery, turned away. For enslaved people across the South, the proclamation rang like a distant bell of hope. Many fled to Union lines, seeking protection and a chance at liberty. Camps swelled with men, women, and children escaping bondage. Some found themselves disappointed. Conditions in contraband camps were harsh, disease rampant, and prejudice remained, but the proclamation gave their struggle legitimacy. It recognized them not as property, but as people whose freedom was tied to the war's outcome. Perhaps its most profound impact was in the ranks of the Union Army, For the first time, black men were permitted to enlist, and they did so with fervor. By the war's end, nearly 180,000 African American soldiers would wear the Union blue, fighting not only for a nation, but for their own liberation. Their courage on battlefields from Port Hudson to Fort Wagner shattered myths and forced the country to confront new realities. In the South, the proclamation was met with fury. Slaveholders raged at Lincoln's decree, seeing it as proof that the Union sought not just to defeat them, but to dismantle their entire way of life. Newspapers labeled it an incitement to insurrection, and Confederate leaders vowed resistance to the last. Thus the proclamation did more than alter policy, it deepened the war's intensity, ensuring that peace could never come through compromise alone. From this moment on, the struggle was one of absolutes, union or disunion, slavery or freedom. The summer of 1863 would prove decisive, a season when the war's balance began to shift. The Confederacy, emboldened by earlier victories, sought once again to carry the fight into Northern soil. General Robert E. Lee led his Army of Northern Virginia into Pennsylvania, hoping a great victory would shatter Northern morale and perhaps force peace. What followed was 3 days of unimaginable carnage in the quiet town of Gettysburg. On July 1st, Confederate forces pushed Union troops through the streets, but by the second day, Union lines held firm on the high ground of Cemetery Ridge and Little Round Top. When dawn broke on July 3rd, Lee made his boldest gamble. 15,000 men surged forward in what became known as Pickett's Charger, mile-long advance across open fields under a storm of Union artillery and musket fire. The charge ended in devastation. Waves of grey uniforms cut down before they could break the Union line. Gettysburg became the high water mark of the Confederacy, the point beyond which Southern fortunes would never fully recover. At nearly the same time, far to the west, another drama was unfolding on the bluffs above the Mississippi River. For 6 weeks, Union General Ulysses S. Grant besieged the city of Vicksburg, a fortress town crucial to controlling the river. Inside, Confederate soldiers and civilians endured constant bombardment, food dwindling until mules and even rats became meals. On July 4th, a day after Lee's retreat from Gettysburg, Vicksburg surrendered. The Union now commanded the Mississippi, splitting the Confederacy in two and tightening the noose around its resources. The twin victories of Gettysburg and Vicksburg were a turning point, not only in military terms, but in the war's very psychology. The Union, once reeling, now saw hope. The Confederacy, battered and bleeding, began to glimpse the enormity of the struggle it faced. Yet these triumphs came at a cost nearly beyond reckoning. Tens of thousands lay dead or maimed, and the land itself seemed scarred by the scale of destruction. Still, from the ashes of those bloody fields rose a new conviction that the Union might yet endure, and that freedom for millions was now inseparably bound to victory. The war was far from over, but the tide had begun to turn. As the war dragged into its 4th year, the Union sought not just to defeat Confederate armies in battle, but to break the very backbone of Southern resistance. General William Tecumseh Sherman, a man both feared and admired, became the architect of this strategy. In the autumn of 1864, he began his infamous march to the sea. With 60,000 men, he cut a swath across Georgia from Atlanta to Savannah, leaving behind a trail of smoldering towns, twisted railroads, and shattered farms. Sherman called it hard war, a brutal recognition that the Confederacy drew its strength not only from its soldiers, but from the land and the people who sustained them. For those who lived along the march, it was an apocalypse. Barns emptied of grain, livestock slaughtered, houses ransacked, and the silence of ruin settled in the wake of blue-clad columns. Yet Sherman also carried another message, that the Union's advance was unstoppable, inevitable. By Christmas, Savannah lay in his hands, offered to Lincoln as a gift. Meanwhile, in Virginia, Ulysses S. Grant pressed relentlessly against Lee's weary army. The battles of the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, and Cold Harbor bled both sides. But unlike his predecessors, Grant refused to withdraw. He understood that attrition, however cruel, favored the North's greater numbers and resources. By spring of 1865, Lee's men were starving. Their lines stretched thin around Petersburg and Richmond. At last, on April 2nd, Richmond, the Confederate capital, fell. Just a week later, at a quiet farmhouse in Appomattox, Lee surrendered to Grant. The war, at least in its great battles, was over. Yet even as church bells rang and crowds rejoiced, sorrow shadowed the victory. On April 14th, Abraham Lincoln sat in Ford's Theater, his heart perhaps lightened by dreams of peace. That night, an assassin's bullet struck him down, and the nation that had endured 4 years of bloodshed was plunged into mourning. Lincoln's death robbed America of the leader best suited to heal its wounds, leaving Reconstruction in the hands of others. Sherman's march, Grant's determination, Lee's surrender, these moments closed the chapter on the Civil War, but they opened another filled with uncertainty. Freedom had been declared, the Union preserved, but the scars ran deep, and the question remained, how would a fractured nation learn to live as one again? The cannons fell silent in 1865, but peace was not the same as healing. The war had ended, slavery was abolished, and the Union preserved. Yet the road ahead was strewn with uncertainty, bitterness, and betrayal. Reconstruction was meant to be the bridge between devastation and renewal, but it became, instead, a battlefield of its own, fought not with muskets, but with laws, policies, and ideologies. Freedmen for 1 million formerly enslaved men, women, and children stepped into an uncertain dawn. Some walked barefoot from the plantations that had claimed their lives for generations. Others searched desperately for family torn from them by auction blocks and slave traders. For many, freedom meant mobility, the right to choose where to go, who to work for, and how to live. Churches blossomed, schools arose, and communities took shape, determined to claim the dignity long denied. Yet freedom without protection was fragile. The promises of Reconstruction, the right to vote, to own land, to live free of terror, were undermined almost as soon as they were written. White supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan emerged from the shadows, wielding violence and fear to restore the old order in new forms. Southern legislatures passed black codes, laws designed to shackle freedmen to poverty and dependence, while Northern resolve to enforce equality waned. Politicians in Washington argued fiercely, should the South be punished or reconciled? Should freedmen be granted full citizenship immediately or cautiously over time? The answers fractured the nation's politics, leading to impeachment trials, contested elections, and bitter division. For a brief moment, there were victories. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments abolished slavery, granted citizenship, and protected the right to vote, at least on paper. African Americans served in state legislatures and even in Congress, a sight unimaginable just years before. But the backlash was relentless. By the late 1870s, Reconstruction collapsed under the weight of compromise and fatigue, leaving the South to its own devices. What followed was nearly a century of segregation, disenfranchisement, and Jim Crow laws, proof that while the war had destroyed slavery, it had not destroyed the ideology behind it. The American Civil War was more than battles, and General Zit was a reckoning with the nation's soul, and Reconstruction showed that the reckoning was far from over. Its legacy endures in every debate over race, equality, and justice, reminding us that history is not just the past, it is the unfinished struggle of the present. The war ended in surrender, but the questions it raised about freedom, unity, and the meaning of America remain unanswered, echoing still in the American story. The story of America does not end with the fall of cannons or the signing of amendments. It stretches onward like the rivers that carved its landscapes, restless, turbulent, and unceasing. From the earliest footsteps of native peoples across untouched plains to the towering cities of steel and glass that pierce the modern sky, America has always been more than a country, has been a contradiction, a dream in constant conflict with its own reality. The Revolution promised liberty yet left many in chains. The frontier offered opportunity yet displaced countless lives. The Civil War proclaimed equality yet birthed generations of inequality. And every triumph has carried with it an echo of loss. It is a nation that builds and destroys in the same breath, that creates ideals so vast they inspire the world, yet struggles endlessly to live up to them. To study its history is to walk through shadows and light, to hear the roar of industry alongside the silence of forgotten voices, to feel the weight of struggle pressing against the possibility of reinvention. Some historians suggest that this tension is not a flaw but the very essence of America, that it is the struggle itself which defines the nation, the unfinished quest for an identity that unites rather than divides, that includes rather than excludes. Others argue that the contradictions may never be resolved, that America is destined to remain forever incomplete, a dream pursued but never fully grasped. What cannot be denied is the scale of the story. No other land has witnessed such rapid transformation. No other people have reinvented themselves so often. No other nation has wrestled so publicly with its own failures while insisting on its promise of greatness. To listen to America's history is to hear a song both haunting and unfinished, a melody that shifts from triumph to tragedy and back again, leaving behind questions more powerful than answers. Who truly belongs to the promise of America? What is the cost of freedom when it is unevenly shared? How long can a dream survive when shadowed by betrayal? These questions, born centuries ago, remain alive today in every debate, every protest, every hope for a better tomorrow. The story does not end because America itself has not ended, is still unfolding, still being written in streets, in laws, in lives. And perhaps that is the final truth. America is not its victories or defeats, not its presidents or its wars, but the restless journey itself. Sit back, reflect, and listen closely. The echoes of its past are still speaking, reminding us that history is not behind us, but within us, shaping the path we walk even now.